Welcome to Aphelion. This is a place where philosophy arrives quietly. No arguments, no pressure, no attempt to convince anyone of anything. We simply take a subject and look at it carefully, the way you might study an old map, noticing what matters, what can be set aside, where people tend to lose their way, and where they might find themselves again. Before we begin our journey through the teachings attributed to Jesus, if these slow philosophical reflections help you settle your mind and rest, consider leaving a like and subscribing to Aphelion. It helps other people searching for meaning find their way here. Tonight's subject is what we might call the philosophy of Jesus Christ. Not in an academic sense, not as a system of terminology, but as a particular way of seeing human life. In the Gospel texts, this way of seeing comes through in short phrases, parables, gestures, responses to questions, and behavior in specific moments of encounter. If you read it as a language of meaning, what emerges is a set of questions about what genuine wealth looks like, what real strength is, what a person is actually worth, and why the important things are so often found in the places we have stopped looking. The human context matters here. Jesus lived in a world where people understood helplessness and the hunger for change. It was a province inside a large empire, carrying the weight of taxation and a social order where most people were born into their position and stayed there. There was abundant religious language, many rules, ongoing arguments about correctness, and alongside all of that, ordinary poverty, illness, everyday cruelty, and exhaustion. In times like those, people learned to live in survival mode. They trust less, protect more, guard what is theirs, suspect what is not, fear the future, and look for someone strong enough to restore order. They want a quick answer to who is to blame, and what should be done about it. And into that landscape came a voice that spoke differently, quietly, without constructing a philosophical system in the way of a school or academy. This voice spoke with people on roads, in houses, on hillsides. It took images familiar to everyone: seed, bread, water, debt, a journey, a house, and through them revealed another dimension of ordinary life. That is the distinctive quality. It did not ask people to leave the world for the sake of a pure idea. It looked directly at the most common human experience, and said that this, right here, is where the essential things are decided. A brief word about the life, just enough for context. Jesus was a Jewish man who grew up in Galilee in ordinary circumstances, far from centers of power. His public activity was short by historical standards and took place mostly in small towns and villages. He taught, told stories, disputed with those who positioned themselves as guardians of correct thinking, and was particularly close to those whom society had written off: the poor, the sick, people with damaged reputations, anyone it was convenient not to see. His life ended in execution, the way lives ended for those who seemed dangerous to the established order. What followed, the story of his followers and the tradition that grew from them, cannot be summarized in a sentence. But for our purposes, this is enough. At the center of his words is not a new set of rules but a new way of seeing the human person and the shape of a life worth living. It matters how we approach this, because even the most carefully written texts can be read in ways that turn them into weapons rather than light. When we speak of the philosophy of Jesus, we are not claiming it is a textbook of logic or a system of proofs. We are pointing to a core orientation, a sense of what is real, where a person's foundation lies, how to distinguish the surface from the essential, and what makes a life genuinely human. The gospel language does not always respond with a direct formula. It tends instead to present a situation and invert the expected conclusion. If someone comes to these texts looking only for instructions, they will be disappointed. What is offered is closer to an invitation to look differently. And so the first idea is this: this philosophy is a way of seeing. Not a checklist, not a competition in religious knowledge. A way of looking that works its way into how a person thinks, chooses, and treats others and themselves. Why did this emerge in this particular form? Because the people around Jesus lived in a world where correctness was valuable currency. Being correct gave status, a feeling of safety, a sense of belonging. And that same correctness could become a kind of coldness, a habit of dividing people into the worthy and unworthy, the acceptable and the unacceptable, those deserving of sympathy, and those deserving of contempt. The common mistake in understanding this is to reduce everything to the external, as if what matters is saying the right things, belonging to the right group, performing the right rituals. But in this way of thinking, everything runs the opposite direction. The outward has meaning only when it expresses the inward. When the outward becomes a substitute, it becomes a mask. A mask can look convincing, but it does not make a person alive. A simple example from everyday life. Imagine someone who is meticulous about the language of fairness and honor, fluent in the right formulations, always ready to explain how things ought to be done. And yet with the people closest to them, they are cold. Toward weakness, they are irritated. Towards someone else's pain, they are indifferent. Outwardly, they appear decent. But being near them makes the air feel tight. That gap between the display and the interior is precisely what this philosophy tries to close, so that words, actions, and motivations no longer live in separate worlds. From here, a second layer follows naturally. There is a concept in these texts that appears frequently and tends to generate the widest range of associations. It is usually translated as the kingdom of God. This phrase is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It is not a map of a territory. It is not a political slogan. It is closer to a way of naming a different order of life, one in which the primary reality is not determined by power, fear, or status. It is a way of looking at things in which the most important things are not necessarily loud, and the most valuable things do not necessarily shine. Why did such an idea arise? Because in human societies, one pattern tends to assert itself reliably. What matters is whoever has the most power, money, connections, and visible success. Even if that person is hollow inside, even if they are cruel, even if they operate through fear, the outside can look like victory. And many people end up organizing themselves around that appearance, either chasing it, envying it, resenting it, or submitting to it. In any case, they remain tied to the same thing, dependence on force. The voice in these texts points towards something different. Importance is measured differently here. The decisive person is not the one capable of crushing others but the one capable of refusing to betray what is good. Not the one who can put everyone in their place, but the one who can preserve another person's dignity. This is a quiet inversion. The world stops being an arena where the hardest person survives, and becomes a space where the real victory is not to humiliate but to restore. Not to take but to give. Not to prove but to heal. The common mistake here is to hear this either as pure mysticism, something far away and not relevant to present life, or as pure politics, a program for new power arrangements. Neither reduction fits. The idea is closer to an inner law that expresses itself outward. When a person's foundation shifts, so does the way they build relationships, use whatever power they have, and regard the dignity of others. The different order becomes visible not through slogans but through the quality of ordinary life. A grounded example is visible in any structure where one person has formal authority. There are two ways to maintain order. The first is through fear. If things are not done as I say, there will be consequences. This can be externally effective. People comply, but beneath the surface they harbor resentment, conceal truth, do the minimum required to avoid being targeted. The second is through respect and consistency. Speak clearly. Follow through. Protect the weaker person. Acknowledge mistakes. Do not humiliate. This is sometimes more difficult. But near someone who leads this way, others find room to be genuine. Gradually the group holds together not through fear but through trust. In a small register, that is what a different order looks like when it becomes real. And this connects to a third point. If importance is no longer defined by visible power, then how we regard the human person must also change. Ordinarily, a person is evaluated by recognizable markers: success, reputation, usefulness, belonging to the right group. But this way of thinking consistently moves toward those whom society does not habitually value. The third idea, human dignity, is not purchased or earned through status. It does not depend on how successful a person has been, how convenient they are, or how well they have fitted in. In the narratives around Jesus, the people on the margins appear again and again. Those who are given no voice, who are considered an embarrassment, who have been written off, who are called surplus. And what happens in these encounters is that their human name is returned to them. The message is something like, your worth is not cancelled by other people's contempt. Why did this idea emerge this way? Because every society tends to construct an invisible hierarchy. At the upper levels, the strong and the visible. At the lower levels, whoever is in the way, whoever is weaker, whoever does not meet the standard. This hierarchy can feel natural, as though life simply works this way. But it generates cruelty. First a habit of not noticing. Then a habit of justifying someone else's suffering. Then a habit of deciding they have it coming. At some point a person stops seeing another person and sees only a category, a label, a problem. This way of thinking tries to interrupt that process at its root. It says that a person's worth is not cancelled by illness, poverty, past mistakes, or the opinion of others. This does not mean all behavior becomes acceptable. It does not remove accountability. But it means a person does not become permanently identical with their worst moment. They remain more than their worst page. The common mistake here is to confuse dignity with the idea that anything goes. As though acknowledging a person's worth means no boundaries can be maintained, no corrections made, no refusals offered. But dignity does not remove limits. It concerns the tone and the position from which limits are set. Limits can be set in a way that makes a person feel like waste. Or they can be set in a way that makes a person feel seen, not humiliated, addressed as someone real. That way of speaking and acting is part of this philosophy. A practical example is near most people. There is usually someone in a family or a circle of acquaintances who has come to be regarded as a problem. Unsuccessful, difficult, frequently mistaken, short of money, always arriving at the wrong moment. The easiest response is to write them off, to treat them as an irritating detail that must be endured. The other response is to see them as a person without pretending the difficulties are not there. This does not mean tolerating everything. It means at least not stripping them of respect, not making them the subject of conversations held behind their back, not speaking of them as though they are incapable of change. That is what the return of dignity looks like in practice. Not dramatically, not theatrically. In tone, in attention, in the absence of contempt. Now if we hold the three starting points together, a quiet sequence emerges. We read these texts not as a cold code and not as an invitation to argue, but as a language of meaning. At the center of that language is the idea of a different order of life, one in which worth is not defined by force or fear. And from that follows the third point. Human dignity does not belong only to the correct and the successful. It is wider, deeper, and nearer than is usually assumed. One last clarification before moving on, so there is no impression that this is simply a refined form of secular humanism. In this way of thinking, human dignity is connected not only to the observation that people are good. It is connected to the idea that a person stands before God rather than before a crowd. The measure of a person is not set by the opinions of others or by their record of achievement, but by something that goes deeper. Whether one takes that literally or as the language of spiritual experience, the meaning holds. A person cannot be fully explained by a label. They exceed every category applied to them. From that comes a strange and quiet confidence visible throughout these stories. Jesus speaks with people it was not acceptable to speak with. He touches those it was not acceptable to touch. He enters spaces that the respectable person avoids for fear of reputational damage. And this confidence does not look like revolutionary heat. It looks like certainty about a different order. If what matters most is mercy and truth, then the fear of what people will think loses its authority. The ordinary version of that confidence appears in something very small. Sometimes a person is in a gathering where everyone is silently diminishing someone, laughing, making it seem normal. And the easiest response is to say nothing, to stay safely inside the circle. Another response is to say quietly, without drama, "That is not something I want to be part of." That is not heroism. It is the recognition of another person's dignity. It is a small signal that the important thing and the majority opinion do not always coincide. Let this first part rest here, just as it is. a frame and a first set of foundations. No rushing, no racing ahead of the meaning. 3 initial things placed on the table. How to read these texts as a philosophy of life. What a different order looks like at a human scale. And why the person nobody tends to notice keeps turning up at the center. The next natural movement is toward how love functions as a principle in this way of thinking, and how it changes the texture of relationships between people. When the first foundations are in place, something that is usually drowned out by noise becomes easier to hear. If human worth is not purchased through power or success, an unavoidable question follows: what holds relationships between people together? And by what principle can they remain genuinely human? In the gospel texts, the answer to that question appears repeatedly, and without urgency. Love there is not described as life's decoration or as a rare stroke of fortune. It is described as the axis around which everything else arranges itself. This matters enormously, because the word love in ordinary speech too easily means a strong feeling, a pleasant attraction, or a story about how good it feels to be near someone. That meaning is not wrong. It is simply different. In this way of thinking, love is closer to an inner faithfulness toward what is good and toward the other person. It is a direction chosen even when the mood shifts, even when gratitude is unlikely to follow. The first idea here is that love is described as a moral force rather than an emotional climate. Emotions arrive and depart. They depend on fatigue, pain, luck, memory. A life built entirely on emotional states will move the way moods move. The love in these texts is not a command to feel something. It is a different center of gravity. Preserve what is human. Do not turn another person into an object. Do not trade in dignity. In that sense, love is not a flash but a direction. Why did this framing emerge in these texts? Because the world Jesus inhabited was one of very rigid social boundaries. Love could easily become a privilege, something offered to your own people while the rest remained outside and suspect. Inside that logic, a society quickly becomes tribal. Small circles of warmth surrounded by widespread indifference. This way of thinking tries to break that habit. It suggests that if goodness is limited only to the convenient group, it remains too small to survive real conditions. It breaks at the first serious conflict. Love that depends entirely on liking is always conditional. The idea here is that goodness might become more durable than liking. The common mistake in understanding this is to take it as softness without a spine, as if love means being agreeable at all times, never refusing, never disagreeing. But this version of love does not require formlessness. It can be firm. It can say no. It can refuse to support what is destructive. It simply does so without humiliation, without pleasure and power, without the desire to crush. Its aim is not victory but the preservation of what is human in situations where contempt would come very easily. There is an opposite mistake as well, treating love as a heightened emotion available only to those who feel it intensely, as though without a particular internal state one cannot be kind. Then a person waits for a special condition, and in its absence justifies coldness. But this logic removes the option of decency from ordinary life. The point is not whether the feeling is present. The point is whether a person continues to behave as a human being even when the feeling is absent. A simple example is visible in places of obligatory closeness, a family where exhaustion has accumulated over years. People live side by side, speak briefly and without warmth, like neighbors who share a stairwell. Nothing is dramatic. No one is shouting. But the air is sharp. In that situation it is easy to say, there is no love here, so nothing can be done. This way of thinking disagrees. Love is not something that arrives as a feeling. It is what keeps a person from turning someone close to them into a target for their frustration. Sometimes love looks like plain human steadiness, not punishing with words, not stockpiling small humiliations for one large retaliation, not turning a conversation into a courtroom. That is not romance. That is durability. If love is a direction, the next thought in these texts follows logically, even if it is difficult to hear. Love does not end with the pleasant. It touches even the unpleasant. And here appears one of the more unusual themes, the treatment of those who feel like enemies. The second idea is that this way of thinking attempts to interrupt the chain of mutual retaliation. An enemy does not have to be someone holding a weapon. In ordinary life, an enemy becomes whoever caused pain, humiliated, betrayed, exploited, deceived, destroyed trust. And the first response is almost always a desire to restore balance through a return blow. Not necessarily physical. Sometimes it is coldness, silence, sarcasm, a public exposure, or simply the wish that the other person suffers the same thing. From the inside, this looks like the restoration of justice. But it very often becomes an endless loop. Pain produces pain, and everyone involved believes they are only responding. This way of thinking offers a different exit. Stop the loop at the point where it was supposed to continue. Not because the wrong was not wrong, but because the loop makes a person resemble the very thing they resent. That is the subtle point. The pursuit of justice can quietly become the pursuit of a feeling of moral superiority, and then a person loses themselves even if they are formally right. Why did this idea arise? Because a community where everyone responds to a blow with a blow becomes a community of permanent revenge. It may dress itself in law, tradition, duty, or religion, but the inner mechanism is always the same: do not forgive, do not yield, do not release. And that mechanism destroys not only those on the outside but those within. It turns life into an endless trial where no one is ever acquitted. The common mistake here is to hear this as a suggestion to call harm harmless, to keep placing yourself in positions of vulnerability, to accept ongoing damage. But this way of thinking about treating an enemy is not naive. It does not say, let it continue. It says something different. Do not hand the management of your inner life over to someone else's hostility. Do not let another person's cruelty determine your shape. Limits can remain. Protection can remain. The difference is that inside, the poison is not added, the desire to destroy is not fed, the pleasure at the other person's collapse is not cultivated. A concrete example can be seen in an ordinary professional conflict without any dramatic dimensions. A colleague at work attributed someone else's results to themselves, shifted blame, arranged things to their own advantage. Formally, the situation resolved somehow. But inside remains the feeling, I need to return this. And so begins a quiet campaign, small provocations, strategic omissions, cold smiles, everything outwardly professional, inwardly at war. This rarely restores justice. More often it turns a person into someone who lives inside another person's shadow. Not retaliating in that context is not weakness. It is refusing to spend a life on someone else's account. The third idea follows naturally. If love does not end with pleasant people and does not simply retaliate against unpleasant ones, something else is needed as a principle for how to treat others. In these texts it appears in what is sometimes called the Golden Rule, though the name matters less than the content. The point is that the relationship with others is not built on the logic of profitable exchange. Ordinary relationships often function like a market. I am good to you, you are good to me. This sounds fair. But it is always conditional. The moment the condition breaks, everything falls apart. This approach goes deeper. It suggests measuring actions not by what is advantageous but by what preserves the human quality of the interaction. It asks a person to consider, before acting, how it would feel to be on the receiving end. Why was this formulation needed? Because people easily justify cruelty by saying this is simply how things are done, or that the other person has no one to blame but themselves. And the more power a person has, the easier it is to stop noticing that their actions cause harm. A simple principle becomes an anchor. Not from fear, but from the recognition that a life conducted otherwise becomes inhuman. The common mistake is to reduce this to ordinary courtesy, as if the point is to be pleasant, to say the right things, to maintain good manners. But the meaning is deeper. It concerns respect for another person's inner life, for the reality that they carry fears, pain, shame, hopes, and weaknesses, and that all of it can be handled gently or brutally. The choice between gentleness and brutality is the moral question. Another mistake is using the principle as a tool for keeping score. I was good to you, so you owe me goodness in return. Then it becomes commerce again. This way of thinking is trying to move a person out of commerce and into something closer to freedom. Here, goodness is not performed for a guaranteed return. It is performed for the sake of goodness itself. That sounds unusual, because people tend to want guarantees. But the absence of a guarantee is precisely what reveals maturity. An everyday example: in a conversation, one person consistently interrupts, dominates, turns dialogue into monologue. They may not notice. The other stays quiet because it is simpler. Outwardly, everything is calm. But inside, an accumulation of invisibility builds. The golden rule in that situation does not mean be polite. It means, remember that you can make another person invisible with your tone alone. It means not occupying all the available space. It means the simple recognition that the person beside you is not a backdrop but a human being. This same logic applies to situations where one person holds more power, is younger, less confident, more dependent. With them it is easy to be harsh, because they will absorb it anyway. But that is precisely where the moral center is tested. How a person behaves towards someone who cannot answer back reveals more about them than any declaration they might make. And here a word enters the text that functions as the natural continuation of love and of the golden rule. It is usually translated as compassion or mercy. It is not the same as pity. It is not sentimentality. The fourth idea is that mercy is the capacity to see another person's need without immediately converting it into a verdict on their character. A person can see pain and instantly begin explaining why it was deserved. They brought it on themselves. They have no one to blame. They made their choices. Sometimes that analysis contains a grain of truth. People do make mistakes. But mercy in this way of thinking looks before it judges. It acknowledges the reality of suffering before it delivers an assessment. It does not begin with accusation. It begins with attention. Why is mercy named as a distinct principle? Because the human mind is efficient. And the most efficient thing to do with someone else's suffering is either to stop feeling it or to explain it in a way that removes the discomfort. They are like that. They chose this. They were not trying hard enough. This produces calm. Life can continue without turbulence. But a world in which this is universal behavior becomes cold, and that coldness eventually reaches even the closest relationships. Mercy tries to return to a person the capacity to remain human rather than becoming a machine that generates justifications. The common mistake is to regard mercy as a weakness that will be exploited. Then a person becomes afraid of being attentive, afraid of helping, convinced they will be taken advantage of. And yes, people sometimes do take advantage. But this way of thinking about mercy is not without discernment. It does not say, abandon your judgment. It says something different, do not let your heart become stone. There is a difference between attentiveness and unlimited compliance. Mercy does not always mean giving everything. Sometimes it means simply not humiliating, not adding fear to an already difficult situation. Sometimes mercy is nothing more than a human tone that does not convert someone's need into a reason for contempt. There is another mistake, converting mercy into a source of self-regard. I helped, therefore I am good. Then mercy is not really about the other person but about confirming one's own positive self-image. This shows itself clearly. The help is performed visibly, the debt is implied, a certain gratitude is expected. This way of thinking consistently resists that pattern. Goodness does not require an audience. It does not construct a pedestal. It simply makes the world slightly less brutal. A practical example. Someone has landed in trouble through their own poor judgment. They borrowed unwisely, believed a deception, spent on something empty, and now face serious consequences. The natural response is, they did it to themselves, let them learn. That is not wrong exactly. But mercy adds another note. Yes, the decision was poor. But they did not stop being a person. It is possible to not endorse the behavior, and still not treat the person as waste. It is possible to help without supporting what is destructive, while also not leaving them entirely alone with their situation. Mercy here is the ability to separate the action from the person. The action may be poor. The person remains a person. That separation makes life less cruel. Another example, quieter and closer to the everyday. Someone nearby becomes difficult because of illness, exhaustion, age, depression, a heavy period. They speak more slowly, act more slowly, forget things, become irritable and unpredictable. And everyone around them wants things to move faster, to be simpler, smoother. Mercy in that situation does not require heroism. It requires patience with imperfection. Not necessarily solving everything. Sometimes it is enough simply not to add to someone's burden the feeling that they are in the way. If these strands are gathered together, love as a principle, the approach to hostility, and the golden rule all meet at the same point, a departure from commerce and from revenge. Commerce says I am good to you as long as it benefits me. Revenge says I organize my life around your pain because you caused mine. What is proposed here is different. Goodness does not depend on benefit. And life does not have to revolve around settling accounts. One more thing worth noticing before moving forward. In these texts, mercy is consistently placed above formal correctness. Not because correctness is unnecessary, but because correctness without mercy becomes dangerous. It becomes a justification for cruelty. A person says, I am right. And with that word, they grant themselves permission to destroy. Mercy keeps asking a different question. Even if you are right, what are you doing with that rightness? If being right becomes the occasion for harm, it stops being rightness in any deep sense. It becomes an instrument. This is especially visible in the moments where these stories show conflict with religious authorities. The disagreement is not about whether goodness matters. The disagreement is about what goodness consists of, observing the form correctly, or preserving the person. And in those conflicts, one position comes through clearly: form matters, but the person matters more. That is not the abolition of structure. It is the setting of a priority. And that priority changes everything. The common mistake is to hear in this a permission to ignore all form, all discipline, all accountability. As though if mercy is primary, anything goes. But mercy does not remove accountability. It changes the tone of accountability. It keeps accountability from becoming a weapon thrown to punish. It makes accountability something closer to medicine, oriented toward recovery rather than retaliation. Distinguishing punishment that simply retaliates from accountability that actually repairs is a genuinely difficult, genuinely mature thing to do. In daily life, this principle appears wherever a person has made a mistake and needs to be corrected. The correction can be delivered with humiliation. You are hopeless. You always ruin things, there is no future for you here. This seems like it teaches something, but it usually destroys. Or the correction can be offered differently. The mistake is named clearly, the consequences are explained, the limit is set, and the person is left with some possibility of keeping their dignity intact. Mercy in that sense is not sweetness. It is the skill of repairing the action without breaking the person. If love is the axis and mercy is its specific expression, a question about the self becomes unavoidable. Because the person who lives by commerce and retaliation tends to be harsh not only toward others but toward themselves. They either constantly accuse themselves or constantly justify themselves, but rarely manage to be honest and gentle at the same time. The love and mercy in these texts are often directed inward as well. Not in the sense of the popular phrase about self-love. In the sense of, do not make yourself the object of your own hatred. Because a person who hates themselves rarely has genuine mercy to give others. Their mercy quickly becomes irritation or performance. The common mistake is to confuse mercy toward oneself with self-pity. Self-pity says, poor me, I cannot do anything. The kind of internal gentleness in these texts is closer to sobriety. Acknowledge the weakness, acknowledge the mistake, but do not convert it into a sentence. That is a theme we will return to in the section on forgiveness and inner honesty. For now it is enough to notice the connection. Mercy as maturity does not exist without truth. It does not close its eyes. It looks directly, but without cruelty. One final note before moving on, so these ideas do not feel like a beautiful ideal suspended above real life. The gospel texts do not describe a world without conflict. There is plenty of conflict in them. Distrust, betrayal, fear, misunderstanding, exploitation. Love in that reality does not look like a soft cloud. It looks like an inner structure, not returning harm for harm, not building relationships on trade, not converting another person into an object, not making someone's failure into their permanent identity. This is not always pleasant. That is exactly why it is described as a path of maturity rather than an emotion. The quiet summary of this section: love here is not a mood but a direction that keeps the human quality intact in relationships. The approach to hostility is an attempt not to surrender your life to a cycle of mutual harm. And mercy is the maturity that sees the person before it sees the label, and offers goodness without making it a transaction. After conversations about love and mercy, there is sometimes a feeling that everything sounds reasonable until the first real impact. While relationships are warm and the stakes are small, these ideas settle easily. But life brings something different: humiliation, betrayal, shame, broken promises. And then it becomes clear that the hardest part of any ethics is not the correct formulations. It is what to do with a past that cannot be undone. In these stories, the theme of forgiveness appears exactly here, at the boundary between the truth of what happened and a future in which a person does not want to be defined entirely by what was done to them. The meaning of forgiveness in this context is not the erasure of memory or the cancellation of pain. It is the breaking of a chain in which everything is determined by a running account of who owes what, who took what, who must return what. This is not the abolition of justice. It is the refusal to make the pursuit of justice the only atmosphere a person can breathe. Why did this idea take this particular shape? Because a life organized around settling scores quickly turns the person living it into a hostage. They may be entirely in the right. They may have every reason for their anger. They may receive the support of everyone around them. But inside, one thing holds them. They keep returning to a particular scene and reliving it as evidence that the world owes them something. In that position, the pain is not merely a memory. It becomes the meaning. And sometimes it becomes a justification for everything that follows. What is offered here is a different option: name the harm for what it was, and at the same time stop building your life around an internal court that never reaches a verdict. Not because the pain does not matter. Because a person can only remain alive when their future is not entirely the property of their past. The common mistake in understanding forgiveness is to confuse it with endorsement. People hear the word and assume they must now call what was bad good, smooth over the damage, smile as though nothing occurred. Then forgiveness becomes self-abasement and silent permission for repetition. That is not what appears in this way of thinking. There can be honest acknowledgement that something was genuinely wrong, and at the same time a refusal to keep the other person installed as a permanent adversary in one's inner life. Limits can be maintained and the internal war can still be ended. There is a more subtle mistake as well. A person announces that they have forgiven, but in practice they have only frozen the pain. They do not want to acknowledge vulnerability or revisit what is uncomfortable, and they do not want to appear weak. So they put a lid on the situation and tell themselves it is finished. But frozen resentment does not disappear. It becomes coldness, sharpness, passive forms of punishment, a quiet pleasure when things go wrong for the other person. Then the word forgiven is a label covering an intact cruelty. One of the images used in these texts to illuminate this dynamic is a story about a person who receives an enormous cancellation of debt and then immediately becomes ruthless towards someone else who owes them a trivial amount. The point is not arithmetic. The point is a mirror. Someone who lives entirely by the logic of exact repayment loses proportion. They begin to believe that their strictness makes them strong, when in practice it makes them dependent, because their whole sense of rightness depends on the ledger coming out even. The story makes a plain observation. When a person recognizes that they themselves live by grace, they become less driven to stand over others with the authority of a collector. Not from weakness. From understanding. Repayment cannot bring anything back to life. A concrete example: two people share a business or a project. One of them makes a significant decision unilaterally, and presents the other with the result. Formally there were arguments for it: experience, investment, connections. But the other person feels not only the practical impact but the humiliation. From that point, ordinary logic quickly converts every interaction into a hearing. Every conversation becomes a form of cross-examination, every proposal a bid for advantage, every disagreement an occasion to revisit the original grievance. Forgiveness in that situation does not mean everything is fine. It means the original blow stops functioning as the steering wheel for every subsequent scene. When forgiveness breaks the internal cycle of retaliation, the next question becomes how reconciliation between people is actually possible. Because forgiveness can be an internal choice, while reconciliation involves relationship, and therefore the real situation of another person. In these texts, reconciliation is not described as an instant restoration of trust. It is closer to the idea of returning a person to shared life without a permanent mark on them. The meaning of reconciliation is not to make everything as it was before. It is to open a path toward a future in which the past does not script every gesture. In that sense, reconciliation is not cosmetic and not the erasure of memory. It is the refusal to maintain a state of war as the default mode of engagement. Why was this needed? Because without the possibility of reconciliation, a community fragments into small fortresses. Each person guards their rightness, maintains their defenses, regards the other as a potential threat. There may be order in such a world, but there is no life. There are rules but no trust. The desire here is to prevent a community from becoming a permanent tribunal. It matters that a person can return, not because everything is acceptable, but because without the option of return, every failure becomes a final sentence, and people begin to live in fear of making any mistakes at all. The common mistake in understanding reconciliation is to romanticize it. People imagine a required beautiful ending, everyone embraces, everything is forgotten, friendship restored. Reality is more complex. Reconciliation may not be possible when the other person does not acknowledge the harm, does not recognize limits, refuses accountability. This way of thinking does not require the performance of harmony. It does not insist that one live adjacent to what is destructive. What it resists is sealing a person permanently inside their failure, and building your own identity on hatred, even when the hatred has legitimate grounds. Another mistake is turning reconciliation into a tool of power. A person pronounces the words "I forgive you" as a verdict issued from above. They position themselves as the judge dispensing magnanimity in a way designed to make the other person feel their dependence and their shame. Then forgiveness becomes another form of humiliation. The logic of mercy consistently avoids this. It does not construct a pedestal from someone else's error. It does not demand acknowledgement of the gesture. It does not invoice its own generosity. An image from these stories that speaks to this: a figure who left, wasted everything, and returns with nothing. Not vindicated. Not restored to their previous position. Arriving empty-handed, sometimes with nothing but the visible fact of having failed. And the point of the story is not a psychological portrait. It is the idea that the door can be open, not because the past became good, but because a future is still possible. This breaks a mechanism very common in human communities, the mechanism of permanent exile. An everyday example of reconciliation, within a family, something becomes public that is experienced as a disgrace. Someone made a mistake that others got to know about. The older members experience it as damage to the family's standing. The younger ones experience it as the fear of being pushed out of the circle. And the struggle that follows is often not about truth but about appearances. Reconciliation in that setting is often replaced by silence. We do not speak about this, because speaking is shameful. But silence does not heal. It only deepens the exile from within. The logic of mercy in such a situation sounds like returning a person to belonging without humiliation. Speaking truthfully about what happened while not converting the person into something whose name cannot be spoken aloud. To speak honestly about forgiveness and reconciliation requires speaking about truth, because without truth forgiveness becomes self-deception and reconciliation becomes scenery. In these texts, truth is connected not only to correct positions, it is connected to internal wholeness. The next idea is this: a person can be externally correct and internally divided. Saying one thing, wanting another, doing a third. Then words become instruments rather than testimony. Truth in this understanding is the alignment of motive, word, and action. not perfect alignment. Honest alignment. This means not performing a version of yourself that you are not, and not covering self-interest with the appearance of goodness. Why did this emphasis arise in this context? Because a religious environment, like any ideological environment, offers the temptation to replace living with saying the right things. A person can talk about moral values while privately holding others in contempt. They can speak about fairness while pursuing advantage. They can speak about truth while deceiving themselves. In this way of thinking, that substitution is more dangerous than open wrongdoing, because it renders a person unable to feel the problem. They are convinced they are on the side of good, and that conviction closes them off from noticing how much harm they are doing under the cover of correctness. The common mistake is to convert the critique of hypocrisy into a justification for attacking. A person begins surveilling others for inconsistencies, catching people in errors, diagnosing, exposing. They feel like a defender of truth, but in practice they are feeding their pride. And they have fallen into the same trap, using truth as a club rather than a light. The critique of hypocrisy in these texts points elsewhere. It does not elevate the judge onto a pedestal. It returns a person to a reality in which the motive matters more than the display. There is an opposite mistake as well, deciding that sincerity means saying whatever comes to mind, as though honesty is the absence of a filter. But in this way of thinking, simplicity of speech is not the same as coarseness. Honesty is not a stream, it is a fidelity, a faithfulness to what you actually mean combined with responsibility for how your words land in another person. You can be sincere and still cause damage. That is not truth. That is an undisciplined tongue. A contemporary example of the pattern being criticized is visible not in religious settings specifically but in any public presentation of values. A person builds an image, speaks consistently about the right things, demonstrates care. They may occasionally do something genuinely good. But what is driving them is the need to appear irreproachable and to retain the right to judge others. The moment someone disagrees, out come the aggression, the humiliation, the label. That moment reveals that the display was more important than the people. The critique in these texts functions as a warning. It is not possible to use goodness as a pass to cruelty. The idea that follows from this concerns what these texts call purity of heart. This is worth distinguishing carefully from a kind of sterility. The meaning of purity of heart here is transparency of motive. The heart in this context is understood as the center of intention, the place from which action originates. Purity is not the absence of feeling, not the absence of mistakes. It is the absence of a double game. It is when a person is not hiding an agenda beneath a righteous surface, not performing goodness in order to acquire the right to control, not distributing mercy the way one distributes coins. In that sense, purity is not sterilization. It is clarity. Why does this matter? Because people are skilled at justifying themselves. External behavior can look entirely acceptable while inside there live envy, greed, the desire for power, the desire for revenge, the desire for superiority. And a person may not even consider this a problem as long as the outside looks right. This way of thinking shifts attention to the root. Not because the outside is unimportant, but because the root determines the fruit. If the motive is infected, even the good things eventually become toxic. The common mistake is to turn purity into perfectionism. A person begins tracking every mixed impulse inside themselves, either spiraling into despair or becoming a judge for others. Then the spiritual life becomes a controlled disorder. But the emphasis in these texts works differently. It does not require the impossible. It dismantles pretense. It does not say, become flawless. It says, stop pretending to be flawless. Another mistake, concluding that motive does not matter, only results do. Then manipulation becomes defensible. I produced a good outcome. What difference does the method make? But in reality, the why changes everything. Identical acts can be a gift or a trap, care or a means of binding someone to you, respect or the purchase of loyalty. The motive shapes not only the act but the person performing it. An example from the domain of assistance. A person supports someone else financially or through connections. Externally, this looks positive. But then comes the requirement of gratitude, control, loyalty. They involve themselves in decisions, impose conditions, invoke the debt at every suitable moment. The help has become a leash. And then it becomes clear that the goodness was an instrument of ownership. The logic of purity of motive cuts off that path. Goodness should not become a means of possessing another person. From this the theme of speech follows naturally, because wherever motive is murky, words become currency rather than testimony. The approach to speech in these texts concerns reliability, not loudness, not theatrical solemnity, but simplicity. When a person feels the need to support their promises with impressive declarations, this often indicates that inside they have already allowed for the possibility of not following through. The oath becomes not an intensification of truth but a compensation for distrust. The orientation here is towards simplicity. Words should be honest enough that they do not need elaborate scaffolding. Why did this matter in that world? Because a community where people do not trust each other begins to operate on oaths, seals, guarantees, and threats. This produces external compliance but not trust. The alternative being offered is not multiplying the volume but cleaning the source of speech, so that a person does not trade in words or turn promises into a commodity. The common mistake is to hear simple speech as requiring dryness or coldness. But simplicity is not the absence of warmth. It is the absence of performance. You can speak gently and be honest. You can speak firmly and be honest. The question is not temperature. The question is whether the word serves truth or serves impression. Another mistake, treating directness as entitlement. A person says, "I just say things as they are," and uses that to justify contempt. But there is a distinction worth maintaining. Precision without mercy becomes a stone. Mercy without precision becomes fog. In this way of thinking, a word should be both true and human. An example. A manager assures a staff member that a matter is resolved, in order to ease tension and buy time, and then begins to evade and qualify. In the end, what breaks is not the outcome but the trust, and it breaks not because of circumstances but because a word was used as an instrument. The commitment to simple speech means not letting a promise become smoke. Fewer words, but those words mean something. The theme of judgment follows directly from speech, and it is easy to misread, so it is worth approaching carefully. The meaning of the caution against judging is not that distinctions between good and harmful actions are forbidden. It is that people are too quick to place a final point over another person. They see a piece of someone's life and draw conclusions about the whole. They see a mistake and make it the person's essence. They see a weakness and decide they know everything about who that person is. Judgment becomes a way of feeling safer. If I have categorized someone as bad, I do not need to understand them. I do not need to encounter their complexity. I do not need to question myself. This way of thinking sees the danger in that movement. A person stops being attentive to reality and begins to live by labels. And a label is always simpler than truth, but always less than the person it is applied to. Why was this worth naming explicitly? Because communities find it easy to become tribunals. There is genuine pleasure in the feeling of being on the right side. And being on the right side requires someone to be definitively on the wrong side. The judgment provides social cement. Shared rightness holds a group together. But that cement is toxic. It makes people rigid and eventually cruel, and the cruelty reaches not only those being judged but those doing the judging. The common mistake is to hear the resistance to judgment as a prohibition against naming harm. As though now one cannot call a destructive action destructive, cannot protect a vulnerable person, cannot stop what is doing damage. But discernment and judgment are different things. Discernment looks at an action and sets limits. Judgment places a label on the person and closes the door. Discernment can be strict and still leave room. Judgment performs a finality that pretends no room is needed. There is an opposite mistake, using this idea as a shield against accountability. You have no right to tell me what I did was wrong. Then mercy becomes a permit. But this is not about permits. It is about the quality and purpose of accountability. Accountability remains. The question is whether it is aimed at repair or at punishment. An example of judgment without drama. A new person joins a group and does not fit the unwritten norms. The group quickly assigns them a role. Odd. Not one of us. Every subsequent mistake becomes confirmation. Every success becomes an exception. That is judgment in its pure form, not an assessment of behavior, but the manufacture of a fixed identity from a label. Another common form of judgment is the conversation behind someone's back. There are rarely serious offenses in these conversations. There is simply the habit of gathering around the weaknesses of others. Someone was late. Someone answered strangely. Someone dressed oddly. Someone said too much. And the group begins to take the person apart as though they are an object. This presents itself as harmless socialization. In terms of what it is actually practicing, it is a training in cruelty. The language we use to describe others gradually becomes the environment we inhabit. If that environment is full of contempt, the contempt eventually finds its way to those closest to us and to ourselves. It is also worth noting, judgment is not only directed outward. A person can place a final point over themselves just as quickly as over anyone else, declaring themselves permanently broken, beyond hope, in the way. This can feel like honesty. It is usually despair wearing the mask of severity. The language of mercy here does not encourage complacency. But it does not encourage self-destruction either. It leaves room for truth and for movement forward, without theater and without verdict. All of these threads, forgiveness, reconciliation, truth, motive, speech, judgment, converge in one place, internal wholeness. But wholeness in these texts does not sound like a self-improvement program. It sounds like a requirement to be genuine, before whatever one understands as the ultimate reality and before other people, without a double layer. The meaning of internal wholeness in this context is living without a false bottom. Not being one person in the public presentation and someone else in private. Not speaking about truth while building a life on small deceits. Not speaking about mercy while quietly enjoying another person's humiliation. Wholeness is not perfection. It is the absence of deliberate substitution. It is a person who, even when making mistakes, does not make the mistake a method and does not convert beautiful language into a cover. Why did this matter? Because in a culture saturated with religious language, the temptation to construct two lives is constant. One for the display, one for the reality. And when the display becomes a performance, it stops nourishing the person living it. It actually makes that person more closed, because now they must defend an image rather than living truthfully. The common mistake is to think that wholeness means continuous public disclosure. A person begins speaking extensively about their own flaws as if transparency itself is the spiritual achievement. This can become a new performance. Look how honest I am. This way of thinking does not require theater. It requires truth without performance and without demonstration. Another mistake is to surrender to cynicism. Everyone performs. I will simply do the same. This sounds like a defense. It is actually a surrender. The critique of hypocrisy here is not designed to convince anyone that everything is meaningless. It is designed to return to a person the possibility of living without double accounting. An example of wholeness in a situation where no one is forcing honesty. A person notices a calculation error that benefits them, and no one will ever know. Outside, everything continues to appear fine. And in that quiet is where character shows itself. This is not presented as heroism. It is simply noted, where there are no witnesses, only the heart remains. And what a person feeds their heart gradually becomes their character. If this section is held together in a quiet summary, forgiveness is the refusal to make repayment the primary meaning of a life. Reconciliation is the possibility of a future without a permanent mark. Truth is the wholeness of motive, word, and action. Purity of heart is clarity of intention without performance. Simplicity of speech is the reliability of a word that needs no theater. The refusal to judge is the refusal to place a final point over a person, while retaining the ability to discern between actions. All of it together returns one thing to a person, the inner freedom not to live in a role. Money, power, and fear, three things that quietly become the center of a life. Not because they are inherently bad, but because they are skilled at promising a simple foundation. security, control, respect. In these texts, these subjects are addressed without romanticism and without a cynical dismissal of real needs. There is no pretense that necessity does not exist. There is instead an attempt to return things to their proper place, so that they do not occupy the place of meaning. On money, it is addressed as though the real subject is gravity. Money easily becomes the measure of worth. Who are you? How much do you earn? How successful have you become? And into a person settles an anxiety that does not end even as income grows, because as the number grows, so do the standards, the fear of losing it, and the habit of comparison. In that logic, wealth becomes not an instrument but a nervous system. It dictates what to choose, who to respect, who to consider an equal. This way of thinking is trying to break exactly that dependency, so that having enough does not become a deity to whom people and relationships and truth are sacrificed. This is visible in how money changes the texture of speech in ordinary life. A person may speak about friendship but maintain an internal calculation of who owes what and who has been carrying less weight. They may help others but make the help a lever of control. They may live carefully but allow the carefulness to become a source of constant irritation with everyone around them. Or they may spend generously but use the spending as a substitute for love and attention. In any of these patterns, money has occupied the space where freedom should be. On power, it is shown as a particular form of temptation. Not simply to manage things, but to confirm oneself through management. A person gains leverage, and begins to feel entitled to more than others, to rudeness, contempt, to different rules. And alongside that, power generates fear. What if they do not comply? What if they laugh? What if I am removed? What if my weakness is exposed? Then power is maintained not through responsibility but through the performance of strength. This problem is visible not only in politics. It lives in families, in workplaces, in any hierarchy. A manager can maintain order through humiliation and unpredictability. One day praise, next day sharp criticism, the day after silence. The system functions, but inside it people stop telling the truth and stop growing. Or another version, power is used as the right not to explain and not to notice. Everything outwardly correct, but the person with the leverage behaves as though others are components that simply should not cause inconvenience. The emphasis here is on the opposite. Strength is given for the benefit of others, not for self-confirmation. Not to demonstrate superiority but to protect those with less and to hold fairness steady without becoming bitter. That is not a call for weakness. It is a requirement of maturity. On the fear of tomorrow, it is easy to make a caricature here, as though this way of thinking endorses carelessness, discourages planning, or forbids thinking about the future. But the concern is specific. Fear easily becomes the internal authority. It makes a person live in permanent defense, accumulating not toward goals but in response to anxiety. Keeping people at a distance to avoid pain. Agreeing to dishonesty to avoid losing a position. Enduring humiliation to avoid being without support. Fear converts life into a corridor where the door feels about to shut at any moment. That fear is not mocked here. It is recognized as a real human vulnerability. What is proposed is a shift in foundation. Meaning and dignity should not be entirely dependent on tomorrow's circumstances. Not because circumstances do not matter, but because when circumstances become the final authority, a person becomes manageable, managed by markets, opinions, employers, crowds, their own panic. And then even a successful life can be internally enslaved. After money, power, and fear, the question of community becomes natural, because people almost always search for their foundation in a group, and a group can heal or damage. The question asked in these stories, "Who is my neighbor?" appears against the background of the ordinary human habit of dividing the world into insiders and outsiders. Community is easily built on identity. Who is like us? Who thinks correctly? Who meets the standard? Who belongs? Mercy, by contrast, expands the boundary. Human regard should not end where convenience ends. The image of the Samaritan in these texts is not a moral greeting card. It is a strike against tribal logic. What it shows is that genuine closeness is not defined by origin or category, but by who is capable of seeing a person in difficulty and not walking past, even without any formal obligation. That breaks a very stable mechanism. I am only responsible for my own people. Because in that mechanism, there is always a justification for indifference, and sometimes for cruelty. What is proposed here is a different criterion for common life. Not status. Not the purity of the group. Human regard. But community is not only about assistance. It is also about conflict. In any group, competition for influence eventually appears, grievances accumulate, quiet punishments are administered, old accusations resurface. And here another thread is important. The restoration of relationship is valued more highly than winning the argument. Not because truth does not matter. Truth does matter. But a victory that reduces another person to ash frequently destroys the thing for the sake of which the community existed in the first place. This does not idealize people. It simply maintains that dignity should be preserved even when a limit must be set, and a mistake named as a mistake. The parables in these texts represent a distinct method of thinking. A parable does not deliver a formula or close a question. It reorganizes a way of seeing so that a person begins to notice things differently. In this tradition, that functions as a form of teaching attention. Not here is the algorithm. But look at familiar reality from an angle you have not tried. That is why the answers are often indirect. Not because they are concealing the truth, but because a direct answer can be swallowed and forgotten, while an image continues to work inward. The images of small things that transform larger ones are important for precisely this reason. A seed barely visible, becoming a tree. A small amount of leaven working through an entire quantity of dough. A single pearl that causes a person to recalibrate everything else they value. These are not stories about magic. They are about the observation that what is decisive often begins without announcement. A small choice in favor of what is good alters a character. A small action of mercy changes the atmosphere of a room. A small refusal of an inner dishonesty changes the chain of what follows. And going the other direction, a small justification of cruelty alters a person just as quietly, just as inevitably, but in the opposite direction. The parable is saying, the essential things often grow from what seems at the time too small to be significant. It is worth naming the places where this way of thinking is distorted or misread. The first distortion, turning the themes about money and fear into a mechanism of shame. Telling a person, if you feel anxious, if things are hard, that means you are not believing correctly, that means you are responsible for your own suffering. That converts a language of meaning into a language of accusation. In reality, fear and need are part of human life, and shame rarely makes anyone freer. It usually makes them more closed and more alone. The second distortion, using what is said about power as a justification for authoritarianism. Since authority is given, it may be used without limits. Then service is replaced by entitlement. Responsibility dissolves, and only the demand for obedience remains. In this way of thinking, that is an inversion. The measure of power is what it does to those with less of it, and how it treats truth when truth is inconvenient. The third distortion, turning community into a club for the correct, where mercy is distributed by invitation and a mistake becomes grounds for expulsion. Then a gathering that was meant to restore people becomes a tribunal. This is particularly destructive because it appears principled from the outside while being cold inside. The fourth distortion, using parables as puzzles for insiders, as a way of marking superiority. We understand, you do not. Then the parable stops being an instrument of quiet illumination and becomes a badge of belonging. But in their nature, parables more often deflate pride than feed it. They return attention to simple things that cannot be purchased and cannot be proven by pointing to someone else's weakness. The fifth distortion, converting this entire way of thinking into a pleasant utopia without limits, where nothing harmful can be named, no one can be refused, no protection can be maintained. That breaks the structure of this thinking entirely. Because mercy here does not cancel truth, human regard does not mean consent to what is destructive, and freedom is not the same as absence of discipline. If all of this is assembled, The picture that emerges is not a collection of separate moral principles, but a single center of gravity. A person should not measure themselves or others by what is visible on the outside. Status, money, reputation, group membership, impressive language. The essential decisions happen not on the surface but in the depth of motive. That is why so much attention is given to wholeness, so that a word is not a currency, goodness is not a leash, power is not a compensation, and community is not a court. And that is why fear is addressed so carefully. Fear can be real. It does not have to be the final authority. This way of seeing rests on several interconnected pairs. Mercy and truth move together, because separately one becomes formlessness without shape and the other becomes cruelty without heart. Freedom and accountability move together, because separately one becomes caprice and the other becomes punishment. Community and dignity move together, because separately a group becomes a machine of exclusion. Money and power remain real forces in the world, but they stop being the measure of a person. And parables, instead of locking life into formulas, teach attention to how small things inside become large things outside, in both directions, toward building and toward destruction. And in that there is a quiet conclusion. The meaning is not in flawlessness. The meaning is in a direction that keeps a person alive in relationships, in words, in the choice of what to rest on, in how strength is used, and in how another person's weakness is met. In brief summary, a person is not equal to their role, their total, or their reputation. Strength is tested by whether the person with less feels safer near it. Fear may speak loudly but is not required to govern meaning. Community holds not through the purity of the circle but through the refusal to convert people into their labels. Truth without mercy breaks. Mercy without truth dissolves. Let this ending remain quiet. In these texts there is no promise of a perfect life and no agreement to become someone different immediately. There is a careful reminder that what is genuinely human is stronger than the mechanisms we build around it, stronger than commerce, stronger than retaliation, stronger than performance, stronger than fear. And if that perspective is held gently in mind, it gradually changes what seems unchangeable: the tone, the motive, the way of moving through power, the way of living among people. Good night.